Hi, good morning, everyone. All right, so let's write down a new trigger where the use case is we have to create a trigger on lead object and which would auto-populate. I mean, it actually does not going to auto-populate, but yes, up to certain extent. The annual revenue value based on the industry. So it does means like, let me describe you the use case first of all. So for example, if you are creating a new lead, all right, so if you are creating a new lead, and let's say what you have selected as an industry value. Yeah. So if you have selected the industry value, like as in banking, so after saving that record, after saving, though you have not entered the value of annual revenue, but what should happen, like after saving that record, the annual revenue value should auto populate. I mean, it should get automatically up to certain values. So, for example, if you have selected industry as banking, the value of annual revenue should become this 19,000, 90 lakh, whatever. For finance, this is the value. For insurance, this is the value. So, this actually means based on whatever you have selected as an industry, the value of annual revenue should be get assigned to these figures. All right. So, this is what is the use case is all about. So this we have to create it on lead and this has to be done before insert or before update. So let me create a new trigger in that case. I would go and create a new lead trigger. Because I am creating this on a lead, I'm going to name this as lead trigger. You can give any name. It should just have to be relevant. Otherwise, you can give any. And the object, the S object, Salesforce object, which I'm selecting would be. One second. Yeah. So the Salesforce object which I'm selecting would be the lead object. All right. So we are creating a trigger with the name called lead trigger. That should be applied on the lead object before insert. But I'm going to extend more event over here. We wanted this trigger to be get fired even before update. So if you are inserting a new record or else if you're trying to update an existing record in both of the cases, the trigger should be get applied. That's why before inserting before. Now let me make it a bulkified trigger. So I'm going to, I mean, like we did this in the last program, right? We have used this trigger context variables now in the same way. In the same way, I'm going to design this as well. So if trigger dot is before, so if it is a before trigger, if it is a before trigger and if it's a before trigger and whether it is trigger dot is insert or trigger dot is update. So this is going to be applied in both of the cases. That means if your event, are you performing an insert operation? Or else if you are performing an update operation, right, is update. Trigger dot is insert, trigger dot is update. In both of the cases, before insert or before update, this trigger is getting applied. So this is somehow, same as we developed this trigger we created in the past, right? So the logic is the same. Now, see this time, because we did in the first trigger, I have explained a lot of the things. I almost tried to explain you each single point of that. So very obviously, I'll consider that there are so many other things which you already know. And I would just focus rather explaining the code and what is happening in the backend that we already have discussed. And there is no meaning to repeat because it would eventually take a lot of time if I will start explaining each and everything in a way which I have explained with the first program. So this would eventually take a lot of the time, which is very valuable at this moment. So this is trigger context variable. With this trigger context variable, I make it a bulkified trigger. That means this logic which I am going to create inside in this block is going to be applicable for both instance, for before insert as well as for before update. The same block is going to be get executed, and there is no requirement to have two separate blocks, rather one for insert and one for update, right? Because the logic is business logic is going to be the same in both of them. So we are combine them in a single. Now, every such record which is trying to get inserted or it is trying to get updated, that goes to trigger.new. Yesterday we have discussed this, right? Every such record which we are trying to insert or update, that goes to trigger.new. So I'm going to make an for loop like this, like just like this. I'm going to iterate every record, right? I'm going to iterate every record. So for from where? Trigger.new. I'm going to iterate every record from trigger.new. And because this time we are creating the, you are creating the trigger on the lead. So every record which is getting created would be of a type lead. So lead, let's say LD record, lead LD record equals from. So I'm going to iterate every lead record, but from trigger dot, because trigger.new is that collection, a list collection, an internal storage memory of trigger itself, where every record which is either trying to insert, which is either trying to get insert or maybe it's trying to get updated, either it's a new record or an old record, that goes to trigger.new. So that trigger would apply the validation over there. Now what we have to check? What we have to check? We have to check for the industry value, right? Based on the industry's values, based on the industry value, what user have selected at either the time of insertion or the time when he was updating the record. So whatever the value the user has selected, right? The value what the industry, because that's a pick list. So user has selected what value. Based on that, I am going to assign the annual revenue by its own. All right. So we'll have to check for the value of industry. And because there are a lot of them, right? There are a lot of them. So it could be like banking, it could be finance, it could be insurance. There are two different ways to do that. You can write an if statement over here. If yahan pe. If industry equals to banking, then annual revenue values this 9 lakh 90 lakh. You go to the second statement, then else if industry equals to finance, else if industry equals to insurance, else if. This is one. The another good way to do this is with the switch statement. Switch statement we have learned, right? Switch on, and which we wanted to switch LD record dot industry value. So based on industry value, based on the selection of the industry value, we wanted to make a switch. And this is much better when there are multiple options to be get evaluated. When you have a multiple options, the nesting of if and else if statement, rather you can go with switch statement. All right. So we have learned this in the past when we were doing our initial programming. We were learning, like we were getting introduced. We were making ourselves to get introduced with the Apex programming functionalities, the different features. So that time we have learned. At that time we have learned a topic called iterative statements. And during in that iterative statement, we have learned the loops, like we learn for loop, while loop, do while loop, enhanced for loop, and we also have learned the switch statement. All right. I guess I have taken a few example as well. So here I'm same. I'm using switch statement. So switch on what? Switch on, see every record out of this trigger dot, the records one by one. The records one by one from trigger dot new, they are going to be get inserted into this temporary variable. So what we have to check the whole record? No. We don't have to check for the whole record. We rather just have to check the industry one. So that's why LD record dot industry. LD record dot industry. Now, when the value of industry is banking, because banking is a text, you'll have to enclose this within single inverted comma. So if the value of industry is banking, and the value of industry for this record, if it is banking, what you have to do? You have to LD record dot annual revenue. You'll have to assign the value of annual revenue. You have to assign the value of annual revenue to this. Let me copy this value. It's pretty simple program. This one. All right. When the value is finance, If the value is not banking, rather it is finance. In that case, you have to assign the value of annual revenue as to be this figure. And similarly, so I'll just copy this whole thing. When it is insurance, if the selection for the industry made by the user is insurance, then the value annual revenue should get assigned to this value. That is what I'm doing, right? Let me copy it once again. If it is manufacturing, when the value is manufacturing, So this is the figure that should be get applied to the annual revenue, right? When it is education, if it is education, then is this something which I'm making? Oh, no, it's okay. Yeah. So the value should be the annual revenue value should be get assigned to this one. Once again, let me copy this and I'll paste it out over here. When the value of industry is consulting, if it is consulting, then the annual revenue should be get assigned to 32 lakhs. Let me copy this for the last time. And if the value of industry is selected as to be energy, the value of annual revenue should be get assigned to 94 lakhs, right? But this is like how we have created. Okay, so let me quickly save this program first of all. Yeah. Okay, चलो वैसे तो प्रोग्राम हो गया है बट फिर भी एक बार मैं इसको एक्सप्लेन कर देता हूँ. So you have created a trigger with this name. You have created a trigger that is applied on the lead object, and this trigger is going to be get fired before insert and before update. So if you are trying to insert a new record, or else if you are trying to update an existing record, an old record, in both of these events, this trigger is going to be get fired. So we have built up a logic. This business logic, what I have created, is going to be applicable in both of the cases. When you are trying to insert, when you're trying to update, this is going to be get applicable in both of the cases. So we have concatenized this both of the events into same block in a single. Now, because whatever you are trying to insert or update, that complete set of record always goes to an internal memory of trigger called as trigger.new. And let's consider we are trying to insert 100 records. So all those 100 records are now present inside trigger.new. So we are iterating them one by one by using an enhanced for loop. So on the right hand side of enhanced for loop, it's always a list collection. Not list, it's always a collection. It's always a name of a collection. On the right hand side of an enhanced for loop, it's always the name of a collection. So in this case, that collection is trigger.new because the records which we are trying to insert or update, every such record, all 100 records, that's just an example, are now present inside trigger.new. So we have given the name on the right hand side trigger.new, and every record, every of that 100 record is of data type lead, is a lead record, and so it's a lead, and then a local object of that. Then instead of checking for, instead of designing an if else, nested if else, else if statement, I preferred switch. Switch on LD record, this one dot industry, that's the value of industry. And accordingly, if it is banking, if it is finance, if it is insurance, manufacturing, or whatever has been given, education and consulting and energy, accordingly, we have assigned the value of annual revenue. It's a hard-coded value because that is what has been mentioned in the. It's a hard-coded value, but that is what has been meant in the program. Now, once that is completed, let me now save this once again. And once it has been saved, trigger is getting applied automatically. That is what is a trigger. You explicitly don't have to call it. If you would save the trigger, it becomes active in the background, right? So let me do one thing. So as you can see over here itself, see, we have the value industry, but the annual revenue is not applied. All right, let me do one editing. So if I would just try to make an editing over here, I just have changed the rating value, right? And because the value of banking industry is banking, we are expecting after saving this record, the annual revenue for banking should going to become 90 lakh. Let's see. Let me try to save this record. See, the value of annual revenue has been assigned. So this was after update, isn't it? This was after update. After update, the value of annual revenue based on the industry value has been applied automatically. And if you would, you can check for others as well, right? For banking, it is for finance, it is 76,000. So if I would make it as finance, let's say, and I'll try to save it. This is getting overwritten. This is getting overwritten, isn't it? 76,000. And you can try, likewise, you can try for every value. If what happens, if there is like, your selection is, if you have selected anything which is not there in the list, for example, biotechnology is not over there. What is going to be happen? Take nothing, nothing. For biotechnology, we haven't supplied any value, isn't it? So this is like, or we can have when else, if you wanted to have a default, you know, if you wanted to have a default, then we can give it like this, when else. Apart from this, apart from if you have any other selection, you can assign the value like, like this. So this becomes a default block in that case. This becomes a default block. Now, apart from this selection, if you would try to make any change, right, the value is getting assigned to the default block. See, and so this can also be done. It's up to us like what we wanted. This can also be done. So if you wanted other than this, if you have made any selection, and in that case, this has to be set a default value, then we can code it inside a block called as when else. All right. So this is what is a trigger. And yeah, of course, the same is going to be applied for the new as well. If you try to create a new record, that time as well. That time as well. It's going to be get applied. So if I am selecting the industry as education, let's see what happens. I have not supplied the value of annual revenue in this case, so it has been assigned to this. All right. What should happen if I would assign a value? For example, you are given the value as education, and you are supplying this value. All right, annual revenue. What would happen in this case? You give the value for annual revenue, so it has been overwritten, right? That value, whatever you have given, would not going to be get considered. Rather, what the trigger is supplying is going to be considered, right? So even though if you would supply a value for annual revenue, or you don't do that, this value is getting created from the trigger itself, right? From the trigger itself. So this is what it was an example. Let me see what next we have. Yeah, this is a small note. You'll have to understand. Upon firing a trigger, if the trigger contains both, and this is a common interview question as well, a validation rule and a trigger on the same field. That this is a common interview question. Okay, for example, if there is a validation rule, or if you have created a trigger, so which one is going to be get applied? Which one is going to be get applied? So this is a tricky question. Let me talk a little more about this. So I'm going to share this diagram with you guys only, or probably I already have shared that. Salesforce order of execution. This is very important. This is very important to me. I was having one another diagram. Yes. Mhm. Yeah, this one. See, so normally they would ask you a question. They would ask you a question. Please mind my words. You can write it down. This is very important. For example, we have a validation rule created, right? We have a validation rule created on particular field, and at the same time, you have also designed a trigger. So which is going to be executed first? This is a very common interview question. This is a very common interview question. This is a very common interview question that on a particular field of an object, if you have created a validation rule and then you also have created a trigger, so which is going to be executed first? Which is going to be executed first, right? So for example, you have created a validation rule uh, by which a particular value, let's say for example, annual revenue is getting updated to 1000. All right. And let's say when the same rule we can implement, like if the selection of industry is banking, then annual revenue is 1000. And this is from the validation rule. And then from a trigger, you have created that if the selection of industry is banking, the annual revenue should become 2000. So what is going to be the final value? This type of question they would ask. So on a trigger, on a particular field of an object, if we have created a validation rule and also we have created a trigger, so which is going to be executed first? Which is going to be executed first? They would ask you this question. They would ask, normally people would answer that trigger would also get executed first, followed by validation. Trigger would execute it first, followed by the validation. But although answer is partially true and partially false as well. If you would ask me the same question, my answer would be that depends on what kind of trigger we have implemented. The question is on a particular field of an object, you have created a validation rule as well as a trigger, which is going to be executed first. So I'll start my answer by saying that depends on what type of trigger we have created. It is not always that the trigger would execute it first and validation second. This would also happen, trigger validation rule would be executed first followed by trigger. That could also happen. That validation rule would be getting executed first and then trigger. And people, I have taken so many interviews, and believe me, out of every 10, 9 would say me this answer, that trigger would always get executed first followed by validation rule. That's partially true. I can say, you are not absolutely wrong, but then you are not absolutely correct as well. So you have to say, in your case, see, you belongs to me. You would going to answer this in a very corrective way, in a very elaborated. If the same question has been asked, is going to be get asked to you guys. So what you are going to say would be like, this all depends on the type of trigger. Which one is going to be executed first among trigger and validation? That depends on the type of trigger. Because if it is a before trigger, always before trigger would execute it first, then validation group. If it's a before trigger, before inside, before after. So if it's a before trigger, before triggers are always executed first. Whereas if it's an after trigger, then always validation rule would be executed first, followed by after trigger. If it's an after trigger, validation rule would be executed first, followed by after trigger. Or this I'm going to share, I guess I'll share this on your WhatsApp group. I'm not sure whether I already did that or what, but I would do it by today. If I'm not, please remind me. Any one of you, please remind me in your group itself. You have to learn this whole thing. This is called as Salesforce order of execution. You have to learn this. This is very important. Not just from the point of interview, this has to be done. This you should know. This you should always know. You have to learn this. You can write down the points, save a record. Also, I think you can start it from You can start it from here. Like the first thing what gets checked, I mean, whether after the request has been generated from user interface, the first thing what gets checked is compliance with us with layout specific values. You can skip this point if you don't understand, but you can understand required values at page layout and field level security. You know this, we can make a field required from the page layout, right? We can make the field required from the page layout as well as from the required checkbox. So if you are not trying to supply the value of any required field, required values, required fields that has been made required either from required checkbox or from the page layout customization, this refers to both of them. So that is the first thing which is getting checked. Second is field level security. Then valid field formats. For example, for the email value, email is one of the field in Salesforce that automatically have that field formats. If you would not follow that format, it would going to throw you the error. Maximum length at the time of declaring a field, you can define maximum length as well, right? Like in the case of a text field, it could be 255 maximum. So maximum length. So these are some of the kind of check that is applied first. Second, it is always a before trigger. Second, it is always a before trigger. इसकी जरूरत नहीं, इसको छोड़ दो. After before trigger, it's a system validation. System validation जो internally लगते हैं. Then custom validation. उसके बाद duplicated rules. After duplicated rules, फिर after trigger. Assignment rule, auto response, workflows. Workflows के बाद में you can go to process builders direct, escalation rules and entitlements. ये इस तरह से याद कर सकते हो. Normally, they would also ask you this question. Among the workflows and process builder, या workflows और flow, कौन पहले execute होता है? And we start thinking like, अरे flow तो नया है, flow तो बहुत recent है, flow तो बहुत powerful है. So flow would execute it first and workflow then. नहीं ऐसा नहीं. Workflow हमेशा पहले execute होता है, उसके बाद process builder या flow. ऐसा ही. तो ये थोड़ा सा जो this whole thing you'll have to this whole thing you'll have to remember. ये आपको याद करना पड़ेगा. This is something called as Salesforce order of execution. ठीक है. I'm going to share this diagram, by the way. I'm going to share you this diagram. So this is one tricky question which usually they ask in the interview. Okay, which one is executed first, validation or trigger? So that depends on the type of trigger. If it's a before trigger, so before trigger would always execute it first, followed by validation. But if it's an after trigger, validation rule would be applied first, then after trigger. All right. अच्छा, for this I'll have to explain you trigger dot old. इसको छोड़ देता हूँ मैं अभी. I'll take it by tomorrow. Because इसके लिए मुझे पहले आपको trigger dot old and old में आप समझाना पड़ेगा. New हमने खत्म कर लिया है. So I'll take this program by tomorrow. We're going to stop today itself over here. Yes. Any questions, guys? That's all for today. Any questions? Yes. Any questions? Any questions? All right. Thank you so much for joining.